कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to our program. On our show today, senior civil servant and first-time author Raghav Chandra and wildlife biologist and journalist Bahar Dutt. Raghav and Bahar, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Beginning with you, Raghav. You're a master's in mathematics and now you're a senior civil servant. And you've written a book on tiger conservation, but through the fiction way, through a story way, the scent of a game. How did this scent come up to you?
You know, it was 2006. I was posted in Madhya Pradesh, and that was the time when every time you'd pick up any newspaper, there was a report about a tiger having been killed in some part of the country or the other. So this thought originated at that time, and I really wanted to chronicle the large-scale tiger poaching and the threat to endangered species around that time. But I began writing much later, and why I wrote fiction is because, you know, as a civil servant in our lives, we're in any case exposed to so much harsh and brutal reality that you know, a fanciful wandering of the imagination is something which gives a lot of solace to your mind.
All right.
So I thought I'd you know, convert it into fiction because I could connect the dots better and make it more exciting for the reader so that it could reach a larger audience.
When you move and when you transition from fact to fiction, there's a little license which is allowed. How does that work for an author? Because you're so aware of the facts also.
You know, there are lots of gray areas which if you were writing non-fiction, you would need to provide hardcore evidence, and the canvas is so large sometimes that fiction allows you to bridge the geography and span time in a more vibrant and in a more intelligible, more easily understandable way. So I think that fiction can sometimes be more powerful than even non-fiction. And so there is merit in using fiction as a mode, and it's only a mode. It's not something that you can use for every story, but some stories, yes, it can be a
They
very
lend
useful
themselves well to that
instrument.
Okay. All right. Bahar, first of all, congratulations on
Thank
coming
you.
out with your first book
Yes.
in the written print.
Thank
All
you.
right, your books
Yes.
in visual form have been coming out.
Yes.
Yours has been a very passionate journey from working with environment-related issues in depth,
Yes.
and then this movement now to reach out to a wider audience.
Yes.
What inspired that move?
Well, I mean, it all starts in childhood, as it is for all of us. And I had decided from when I was very young that I wanted a career which was around animals. And I wanted to be the Mother Teresa of the animal world. So I had already told my parents, I'm going to be out there rescuing animals. And soon I realized as I was growing up that we live in a country which has a lot of poor people who live off the forest and wild animals. And I then discovered in that journey that if I had to help animals, I also had to learn to work with people. So I started a small conservation project working with snake charmers, helping them find livelihoods. And that's where, in fact, the book starts with that point. Chapter 1 is about my transition from this small community project that I was running to my transition to a journalist. And it talks about that journey. How do you go from someone who's passionate about wildlife to someone who who then goes on to national media to report about it, and reporting from some of India's best wilderness areas. So I consider myself very blessed. But what I found was that as I was reporting, there's a lot of deterioration of our environment which is going on, and that's the story I wanted to tell.
All right.
And that's what I focused on in all my reportage in the last 8 to 9 years, looking at what's happening to India's forests and biodiversity.
You know, sometimes books that talk about the environment end up telling you what to do. They can also get preachy.
Yes.
And since the environment is something which is closely linked to our inner nature,
Yes.
but not to our current material world,
Right.
we tend to put it on the back burner.
Yes.
So preachy things really don't work. And you've managed to actually just lay the facts.
Yes.
And despite being so passionate, with a little,
Yes.
non-attachment. How did you manage that?
Thank you. I think you spent a lot of time analyzing my book, so that feels good. But that's absolutely true. It was a tough balance. How do you? I had a story to tell, but there were a lot of facts because I went to all these areas. We were looking at whether it's mining going on, or it's whether there are roads being built through a tiger reserve. So I had to stick to the facts. That's my training as a journalist. But I also wanted to tell a story. What is it that goes on in the mind of a journalist when she's watching all this? What are the dilemmas going on? Do we allow a road in a tiger reserve because villagers want that, people want it? And I think that's the dilemma which India is facing right now. We're all facing it. How much do we develop and how much do we say is okay? Because we seem to believe that nature is infinite. And I think I've tried to say repeatedly in this book, without sounding very dismal about it, that nature is finite, and we have to recognize that, and at some point we have to say that let's manage with what we have instead of just constantly trying to grab more and more.
There are many Indias existing over here, and there is one India that you really interacted with for your book is an India where commerce is a huge issue. Conservation is really not a criteria for doing what we do and how we earn our daily bread.
Yes.
But yet, somewhere we believe that in cities and urban areas where we are talking, for us, we can discuss and debate issues like crazy. But how closely are we linked to nature?
It's an area that really requires a tremendous amount of balance in the way all organizations and institutions work. And I do not really see a conflict between development and environment in that sense. I think we need more realistic environmentalism and sensitive development so as to sort of bridge the gap between the two, and good leadership is all about arriving at the right and the most judicious mix, whether it is the urban sector or the rural sector or business as an individual or as a corporate. You need to strike the right balance. And I think that is the key, and that's where your culture comes in, that's where your experience comes in, your knowledge, and everything must really be a source for providing you the right guidance to arrive at the right level of balance. And I think nobody can really preach what is the perfect balance. It has to come from within, and it has to be something with which you have to grow, something that you have to allow yourself to evolve with, and something which is which benefits the larger number of people.
So you spent a lot of time in central India and in small towns and villages.
That's right.
Do you think that there is a concern about the wildlife, or are issues of livelihood more important?
You'll be surprised that increasingly, even between 2006 when I first conceived the story to today, there is much greater awareness about wildlife, about conservation, and social media is bringing a lot of environmentally conscious, wildlife conscious people together. And I'm pleasantly surprised that now that I'm becoming a little more active to know about how people react to these issues, I find that people are posting a lot of pictures of anything that is wrong with our environmental or conservation measures. Only the other day on Facebook, I saw a picture of two gypsies on either side of a tiger, followed by many other gypsies.
Yeah.
And of course, there was a healthy debate about the vintage of the photograph. Somebody said this photograph was actually much older and not a recent one, but it created a very exciting debate, and lots of people plunged into the debate, and they threw up issues like how far do we go in tourism, how do we regulate environmental tourism? So it's a very pertinent and a very exciting development that is taking place.
I think for the thread of compassion to run from humans to humans, I think it's now the thread of compassion. We are learning to be more compassionate about other living creatures. And I think your book also weaves in that element of compassion.
Yes, it's actually more than just about the tiger, and I'm saying that, you know, conservation is really more than just a management practice. It has to be something which must be your call as a human being, as a part of the larger nature.
Bahar, you worked intensely with communities.
Yes.
Do you think there's a conflict between man and nature?
I think given the current economic scenario, we are moving towards more and more conflict. Even as my time as a journalist, there wasn't a day when we would not get incidents of footage coming in from different parts of the country of leopards being beaten up, or an elephant which had got into some area and the forest officers are trying to drive them away. So I think it's a tough time for both, for animals and humans. And I think we have to look for more and more indigenous solutions. You can't just keep the two separate and say, okay, let's move this elephant away to another area, let's move the leopard out. There are plenty of very exciting examples from around India where people are working towards balancing communities with conservation. And I think that's the future. How do we work with both of them? Because at the end of the day, the land is limited and India belongs to humans and wildlife. So,
absolutely.
yes.
And also how we see reporting, and since you're so intensely involved with the media,
Yes.
to say that when we report progress of a project or an issue or a program,
Yes.
do we also report the cost of that?
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit the nerve of what my book actually touches on, because when I became a journalist, I told my editor, please don't make me do stories on, some cute animal which has been born in a zoo. I said, I want to do environment investigations, which is looking at, we are making economic development, but it's at the cost of our habitats. What's happening to the habitats in which wild animals live? And I think that's the story which this book, Green Wars, also tries to tell, which is that the people, whether they're tribals, whether they're animals who live in a forest, what happens when a dam is made or a mining project happens? Yes, we need mining. This is not like, my book doesn't, it's not a diatribe against capitalism. It doesn't say people should go back to living in the forest and they should, we shouldn't develop. But what it tries to say is, look, this is the cost of development. So if we choose our lifestyles which have a gentler footprint on the planet,
Right.
then there is hope. And that's the hope which this book tries to create.
And what you also say is that, and I think that is also a strength in what you've written, is to say, you put the reader at the center to say,
Exactly.
this is how it is,
Yeah.
this is the cost, these are the benefits. Finally, it needs to be our call.
Absolutely. I think it empowers the reader. I just like to add here that this book is not for the environment activist. I believe that every person has an instinctive liking to nature. It's, we all instinctively feel happier in green spaces and fresh air and wild animals around us. So it reaches out to that basic instinct in every human being. And that's what it tries to say, that if you make those lifestyle choices, because what's happening in our cities is our cities are grabbing resources from all around them. And that's what's putting pressure on our wildlife and our habitats. So if we could have gentler lifestyles, then we could save a lot of those wild animals. It doesn't have to be just one holiday in a tiger reserve. It could take on a more proactive role.
And I think that's where books like yours really help, because in a story, they sensitize readers to things which they may not go out immediately and do, but I think the sensitization remains, and given an opportunity, you use that sensitization.
Absolutely. I think you need to tread more gently on this earth, as somebody said. And conservation and development really need not be a zero-sum game. It could be a win-win, as Bahar said. And we need to sensitize more and more younger people, especially the future generations, about the need to look more closely at the importance of conservation. And the tiger is only a symbol of the larger picture, because it's the head of our biotic pyramid.
Right. So you work with local issues of conservation. You're also in the government. What is the role of the government in ensuring that along with development, environment is foregrounded?
You know, I'll give you the specific example of tiger conservation, and I think the government has, Project Tiger has been a immensely useful, if not successful, program, and things and the state of the tiger could have been much worse, because at the around 1900 we had 100,000 tigers. Today we are left with only about 3,000 odd tigers, out of which half of them are in India, more than half. The issues really are that you need to motivate forest and environment and conservation management officers. You need to ensure that they do their duty, because it's really going beyond the call of duty to be able to do that little bit extra which will save a tiger. And that little bit extra calls for tremendous inner resource and will, and that can only come with suitable motivation, incentives, and also to de-incentivize those who are dependent on killing animals for their livelihood. There are communities today which historically have been criminal tribes which have been dependent on killing animals, like the Pardis, for instance. And though the government has a lot of welfare measures, but you need focused programs, and you need people, including forest officers, who would be looking at their development. So, there are a lot of very complex issues. A lot is happening, but I think there is still scope to do more and to involve every possible stakeholder, including the tourist, who has his own responsibility towards the reserve.
And I think, Bahar, this bit about how the community is involved in saving the environment or
Yes.
protecting it, and how the rest of the country or policies involved in rehabilitating the community. You've done
Yes.
work on that.
Yes, in fact, my work was I wasn't always a journalist. For 10 years, I worked with this community of snake charmers. And again, that's what the book, that's where the book starts. And I went to this one village, which is on the border of Delhi, which has Asia's largest dwelling of snake charmers. And I said, okay, if we're going to help the snakes, we have to help the people who live off them. And for people who don't know, the Wildlife Protection Act, which we have in India, doesn't allow the use of wild animals. So here is a poor community which uses snakes, but there's a law which says you can't use snakes.
Okay.
So what do? So for 10 years, I worked with this community. I went and lived with them in villages across Rajasthan, Haryana,
traveled
Uttar
with them?
Pradesh. Traveled with them, stayed with them. They would put snakes in my bag to drive me away. Because they were very suspicious. They said, why is she coming? Is she going to organize a raid on us? So the book talks about my adventures with the snake charmers.
Okay.
And how they didn't want me there. And then finally how I break the ice, I start living with them. And then we looked at livelihood options which we could develop for them. So we set up shops for them. We set up a band called 100 Charmers, which is 100 snake charmers with the bean, the flute that they play, with no snakes. So they performed in Italy, they performed in Hyderabad, they performed all over the world. And those 100 families did not use snakes. They were getting such a good income from their music. So we helped revive some of their musical traditions as well, which they had forgotten. So for me, that small project was an example of how we can balance conservation and livelihoods.
Okay. And you also talk about, in your story, about how poaching and how there's a transformation there. So tell us a bit more about that book.
See, this book, to give you a brief and to give the reader a brief outlook of what it is about, it starts off with a tigress which is extremely popular and which is famous in the Kanha Tiger Reserve, getting poached, and she just disappears one fine day despite a radio collar and despite her being tracked and all her movements being noted. And around the same time, an NRI who is a very successful young man in Silicon Valley, he has to come and meet his father, who's on his deathbed in Amarkantak, which is near this entire gamut of tiger reserves. And his father has a beautiful old tiger skin. So it's his endeavor to get this tiger skin back with him for his wife to the USA. But the father has already expired, and while the son wants to to take the skin back with him, he's left with a message that it has to be given to a conservation museum. So he goes to a conservation museum to give away the skin and meets a young poacher who entices him to show his skin out before a crowd, and he's arrested because they suspect that this is the skin of the missing tigress.
Okay.
So I've talked of the dilemma of the poachers, the history of poaching. I've talked of taxidermy. I've talked of trans-border trade of wildlife parts, and ultimately it's a work of fiction.
So, what's on the agenda next, Bahar?
I don't know. I want to look at, I'm still, people are asking me, are you going to write your next book? But I think so much energy has gone into this one book. So I'm going to wait. I'm going to see what the reader's reaction is and then decide what I want to do next. I think largely in the realm of more positive examples from across India of the good work which is going on in environment. I'd love to document that. The first book was a lot about the churning which is going on in India right now. But I want to focus now maybe on the fantastic positive examples from across India. It would be good to document some of those.
I love the way what you do is feeding into your individual growth and, and seeing different horizons. That's beautiful. Raghav, what's next on the line for you?
Well, a couple of years down the line, maybe I'll look at a follow-up or a sequel to this.
Okay, okay.
So,
to this, and in the realm of
in the realm of wildlife, because this is a subject which is interesting to me, and I think would hold the reader's interest as well.
So wonderful to have such two peaceful guests talking about wildlife. I think that's been so wonderful. Thank you, Bahar. Thank you, Raghav. Wish you great success with everything that you do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, I'm Prajwal Parajuli, and I shall now read an extract from my novel, Land Where I Flee. At this point in the novel, a Brahmin woman who has just gotten fired from her job comes home to find her husband, and decides to ruminate about her relationship with the husband. How ironic it was that her husband, an untouchable, the lowest of the low castes, an upsetting byproduct of the heinous system that our ancestors helped create and propagate, should be so full of piety. He knew the shlokas, memorized elliptical Sanskrit mantras, read the Gita, and understood what festival was celebrated for what reason. He was combative when she, a Brahmin, dismissed Hinduism's many superstitions, made her analyze and reanalyze these beliefs, and furnished her with the scientific reasoning behind them, which she begrudgingly acknowledged. And yet, he could never become a priest. He would never be allowed near the altar of most Hindus. He was a casualty of Hinduism who had chosen not to be a victim. An untouchable who had no shame about his low caste as much as he did of robbing his Bawan wife of hers on account of a marriage to him. A bigger Hindu, a better Hindu than she or anyone she knew. Ram Bahadur Damai, whose kind the Christian missionaries had been targeting for centuries, and whose family had stood firm in their devotion to Hinduism, naming their child after a Hindu god. Ram Bahadur Damai, of the Taylor caste, the father of a half-caste children who would thankfully not be taunted in this country for carrying in their bloodline accusations of incest and consanguinity. Ram Bahadur Damai, responsible for the biggest blemish anyone had brought on her family, for belonging to a family of tailors, of alterers and cutters, for altering family dynamics in a way that could never be unaltered, for ripping grandmother from granddaughter in a way that could never be rehemmed. Ram Bahadur Damai, who gave her two sons in whose DNA were Damai blood and Brahmin blood, one infiltrating another, poisoning another. The two sons her grandmother would never touch, whose presence would desecrate her ancestral house. Ram Bahadur Damai, the untouchable kicked out of Bhutan along with Brahmins, Kshatris, and Newars, the man for whom she had given it all up and never regretted it, was a better human being than any of her family members would ever be.